I'm going to read a poem called Callisto's Song. Callisto was a nymph who was flung up into the heavens and became a constellation. So in order to write the poem, I had to imagine what a constellation might sound like. On the page, I've translated her noise into an asterisk between every word of the poem, and I hear it myself as a sort of white noise, crunching, crackling sound, but I can't speak like she probably would, but I'll do my best. Callisto's Song. Stars, 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 and I am made of them now, looking down on myself then. A Colorito woman, yes, that was me in my red sandals, the great outdoors, curtained, golden, embroidered, and heat shimmer above blue mountains. Nothing vertical, not even the plinth, and no speech, no names then, just a cry as the busybody nymphs stripped me, because we all had rounded bellies then, but 9 months gone, so my navel curved like a gash, and oh, so noticeable among all the diagonals, and everyone looking a different way, looking a lot, especially the goddess, her arrow arm pointing, bow mouth strung, and dogs crouched because they sensed consequences, and gods arriving and doing what gods do upstairs, and the artist's finger loaded, and the paint alive, alive, with stars, 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 stars.